Hello, everyone. Welcome to another lecture for Auto 105 Manual Powertrain. Today, we're going to talk about Chapter 13, which is Manual Transmission Repair, picking up where we left off with Chapter 12, where we talked about the construction of manual transmissions. Again, we're going to be focusing on primarily rear-wheel drive transmissions, not transaxles. However, a lot of the stuff that we're going to be talking about correlates with that. The only difference is again, we're talking about the construction of the different shafts. That's going to be different between a transaxle and a regular transmission. Now, this PowerPoint is 194 slides that we will not be going all the way through, but it is on Canvas. Now, why is it 194 slides? Well, it goes through step by step on how to rebuild a Borg Warner T5 transmission. A T5 transmission is a 5-speed that's found in everything from Jeep Cherokees to Chevy S10s to Ford Mustangs, Camaros, all sorts of different vehicles have that transmission. And Nissan also kind of used a version of it in a couple of vehicles. It goes step by step, which is really helpful. And so I'm going to leave that up as a resource. However, I'm not going to go through it as a lecture. I will probably already lose most of you within 20 slides, let alone 194. But what I will focus on is the beginning of this chapter lecture presentation is going to go over different things you want to look at, and then we'll periodically go through and stop and look at different things based off of the teardown. So I just wanted to make sure that that's understood first and foremost before I get started. But as we're doing an overhaul on a transmission, there's a couple key things we need to determine. The first thing is we need to determine, why are we repairing it? Are we going through the transmission because it needs a refresh, meaning it's got a lot of miles on it and it's not shifting to its optimum performance, but overall it's functioning? Or is there an internal issue that we've diagnosed as the root cause of a complaint? From there, you do need to determine how you're going to tear down the transmission and what you're all needing to look at to perform. When we're doing a teardown because of a diagnosis of failed components, it's going to be really important to find out why those components failed. What was the cause of a gear losing a tooth or of a shaft bearing failing? And then correcting that before we get the transmission reinstalled into the vehicle. We're also going to determine what parts are going to be needed and what the cost breakdown will be with that. And that's going to vary based off of transmission and transmission, as well as parts availability. Depending on how old the vehicle is, parts might be kind of difficult to get. So it is going to be an important thing that we look at in terms of whether or not we're rebuilding a transmission or replacing a transmission. Rebuilding a transmission can be done for a lot of reasons. There can be a shifting concern where the shifter doesn't go into gear as smooth as it once did, or it could be popping out of gear. Those are both indications of like worn out synchronizers. The other big thing that a transmission might need to be rebuilt for is going to be noise. So a noise during certain levels of operation or during all periods of operation may indicate that we do need to go through and rebuild the transmission. It is important to make sure before we start taking apart the transmission that we have a full understanding of what special tools are going to be required, and also what special criteria is going to be needing to take to rebuild a transmission. So in some cases, there are some transmissions out there that do require the mechanic to actually use like a hot plate to heat up components to get them to expand so that they can safely be installed onto the different shafts. Now, that isn't an understanding until you actually look at the shop manual. The shop manual and a repair manual for the transmission is going to be really important. And you need to obtain those before you start taking the transmission apart and possibly missing something that will be detrimental to the rebuild. So having that information ahead of time is going to be really crucial. Tearing the transmission down, though, will give you eyes on what components do need to be replaced, and that is a vital step in the process. But before you do that, make sure you have any special tools that are required, and please make sure that you have the service information required. It's also a really good idea too to pay a lot of attention to all the fine details. I like to write everything down. Make sure that you're taking notes during the entire disassembly. It's really easy to get distracted. Someone walks up and asks you a question, and then you don't know where you left off, or you need to make sure to remind yourself to order a certain snap ring that got bent out of place. It's a good idea to write it down then and there. So having a pad of paper right next to you so that you can quickly jot that down to refer back to it. Rebuilding a manual transmission is a lot of work, but it's not as extensive as an automatic in terms of there's less components, and you will be able to leave a lot of it still assembled if you're doing certain particular jobs. But there's still a lot of different parts, and it's not something that you might be doing all in one sitting. It's not like you're going to sit down and rebuild the transmission and put it back together, and you'll be done in one foul swoop. More often than not, you're going to have to get up to check parts availability, check a manual, check where tools are, and then make sure that everything is in order for the rebuild. We also want to make sure that we keep track of all the components. I personally like to use zip ties to do that. So zip ties with masking tape flags make it really easy to be able to identify components. I also go through too, and I'm only taking apart subsections. So in the case of a manual transmission, I would be taking apart the components on the input shaft and then putting it back together or setting it aside. The output shaft slash main shaft, and then putting it together or putting it aside, and then the counter shaft. That way you don't have everything all yard sailed out on your bench and you can't keep track of what goes where, because after a while all the gears start to look the same and you'll be shoot. So it's a really good idea, again, run a zip tie loosely around it, and on the tag of the zip tie or the tail of the zip tie, put a piece of masking tape, put second gear, speed gear on output shaft, or counter shaft, main bearings, or whatever it happens to be. That way you can very quickly identify it. Those tackle boxes also work really well for that. Now, as I brought up about keeping everything in order, keeping everything in its subsection is going to be really, really helpful. Having a parts explosion like this is usually the best bet for rebuilding a manual transmission, because what it does is it gives you the order in which all the components are. That being said, taking photos, especially with your phone, isn't a bad idea, because you can then tell the orientation. Snap rings will have, possibly a taper or bevel on them so that they can only go one direction. Noting that down and taking photos of it will help as well. But lay all the parts out one at a time, and then once you have that subsection assembled, you can zip tie them together. That way that they don't get intermingled with other components. And you can very quickly and accurately rebuild the transmission from that point. It's also really important too to note down, again, the fine details. Something like this, for instance, there might be an oil groove for the synchronizer hub that will lubricate the speed gear and or the synchronizer itself, the slider and the blocker rings. That has to be lined up with the blocker ring hub. And if you're not paying attention to that and you just pull everything apart and then slam it all back together, you might not notice that, and the transmission might not have the proper lubrication. Now, that wouldn't be a failure that would come up right away. It would come up after a little bit of operating, but the transmission would still fail prematurely. So marking things with a paint pen, noting everything down, again, taking photos is going to be really crucial. When it comes to lubrication ports, this is really, really paramount, because the transmissions are splash lubricated. So there's no pressurized oiling or lubrication going on inside of these cases. So making sure that all of the grooves line up allows for that transmission to live a long life. And you don't want to have a premature failure because of that. It's also one thing to notice too, in case you're rebuilding a transmission that did get rebuilt a little bit rushed or haphazardly prior to you getting into the box. That way you can note, oh, hey, this is why the synchronizer failed prematurely, is the lubrication hole was blocked. We'll make sure that we orient it to where we have proper lubrication, and that the transmission won't have an issue. You've then found the root cause of the issue. Let's look at some of the special tools and equipment that are going to be needed to rebuild your transmission. Now, first and foremost, when we're looking at rebuilding a transmission, there's not a lot of electrical diagnosis we're going to be looking at. It is a good idea to test and make sure that, like, for instance, the backup switch, the neutral safety switch, and if it has it, a skip shift solenoid are functioning. And you can use a meter and a power probe to be able to do that. But everything else is going to be, we're going to be using mechanical tools, mechanical measuring devices, such as a dial indicator, micrometers, bearing presses, seal drivers, and then turning torque wrenches to measure for bearing preload and free play. And then also too the different types of engine support. Engine support's when we're going into the transaxles, but we will have that on some rear-wheel drive applications. So we can see a couple different tools here. A being a dial indicator. All of you are familiar with this because if you've taken any of my classes, you use this exact tool in just about all of them. Same with B. We're using this, the micrometer. That'd be a 0 to 1 inch micrometer. But a set of vernier calipers or a set of dial calipers are going to be really helpful because they'll be able to measure multiple things inside and outside diameter. But we'll talk about other ways that we can measure outside diameter if you don't have a set of calipers. The hydraulic press is probably going to be the most used tool. Having a full understanding of how the hydraulic press works is going to be really paramount to it operating safely and you being able to get the transmission apart. So being able to use that is going to be crucial. The E is a turning torque wrench. Now that does not have a ratcheting mechanism, but it does have a series of springs internal to it that will be able to measure the breakaway torque or how much it takes to actually turn something, and then also to bearing preload. So that will be a very useful tool as well. And then D is a seal installer. Now these are like high density Delrin installers, but you can get aluminum ones as well. You can also use a socket if you're really careful. Other tools that we might need, different bearing splitters and pullers like we see with I and J, slide hammer with different attachments like blind bearing puller and hub pullers for H is going to be important. G is going to be bearing race installers. Those bearing race installers will be necessary for tapered roller bearings. When we're looking at straight roller bearings, if you take this installer and flip it around the other way, that's the right diameter, they work the same manner, and the tool goes in the same direction. If you list the tool and what it's called, taper bearing race installer, but it can install roller bearings if you install it backwards or you use the tool backwards. And then F is if you're overhauling a transaxle, this is going to be a engine support jig so that you can properly get the transmission out. One thing I want to note with these are really, really useful tools, and they can prevent the motor from falling on your head. But you want to make sure that the mounting area here, and here can withstand the weight of the engine. So the radiator cowl and the inner fenders need to be strong enough to be able to do so. With the inner fenders, you want to be careful because you can fold the fenders in on themselves. You might not notice it right away, but you will when you slam the hood shut. Another thing that you want to make sure that you're wary of, and you can ask me how I know because I've done it before, is this portion right here gets really close to the windshield, and I may or may not have cracked a couple in the past on some vehicles, and we had to replace glass because of that. So definitely, if we need to, you can move this guy further towards the radiator cowl to get that away from the glass. But this threaded screw that goes down this way will allow you to manipulate the engine up and down to be able to get the transaxle out a little bit easier. And a couple other tools that we'll be needing during the overhaul standpoint of it. End down there at the bottom, that is a slide hammer for specifically blind hole, but a small blind hole pullers like pilot bearing, stuff like that. Snap ring pliers, finding a good set of snap ring pliers is really crucial, and they're not all created equally. It's going to be kind of ones that you find that work best for you. Depth gauges, and then M is an interesting one. So M is what's called the transmission vise. Now, not all transmissions will have the ability to do this, but what this is this is a vise with two jaws that kind of move around, and you kind of treat it like you would like an engine stand. If you're overhauling an engine, you can bolt the transmission case to this, and this will allow you to rotate it around. Obviously, it has to be on a bench that is stiff enough and heavy enough to where it won't pitch over. But these are really, really helpful. I don't personally use one when I overhaul transmissions, and the reason being is I've never had the access to one that would fit on the transmissions that I usually am rebuilding. Each manual transmission is a little bit different. In the case of the T5 transmission that we're going to highlight in this PowerPoint presentation, you would bolt the transmission to the case assembly to the vise via the case assembly, and you could manipulate it. The S40 Honda transmissions that you're going to be rebuilding in class, however, they don't have that ability, and that's because you put them flat on the bench and you take the back cover off and everything's kind of just right there. So you don't need a support jig. The Chrysler transmissions and Mercedes manual transmissions that I've rebuilt don't really use these. When I was working on the Porsche shop, I only got in a couple Porsche transmissions, but it was the same thing. I never used these. So it is a case by case basis, but it is a very helpful tool when it does work for the transmission you're overhauling. Now, a key term that I'm going to go over during this overhaul process is what type of parts we're using. Now, there's going to be service parts and there's going to be hard parts. Service parts are what's considered wear items inside of the transmission, and during a normal overhaul would be replaced. Those are going to be gaskets, seals, and then the synchro blocker rings. So if you have a transmission that's going to be like refreshed to go back into a vehicle because it's got some age on it, you would get a typical overhaul kit, and that's what's photoed below. Those are two examples of overhaul kits where we can see we have the series of blocker rings. We have all of the support bearings, the gaskets, and the seals that are associated with that transmission. So there's not a lot when you're, rebuilding a transmission to just freshen it up. There's not a lot that you're going to be replacing. Now you can do, you can go through and you can deburr all the speed gears, and you can send stuff out to be shot peened so that it's hardened, or do different coatings on the speed gears and shafts to, encourage better lubrication and lower temperature operation, but you're not doing a whole ton unless you're changing gears out. And if that's the case, then you're getting into the hard parts. Now, the hard parts are going to be components that need to be inspected, but usually aren't replaced during an overhaul. And if they are replaced during an overhaul, that's because there's an issue going on with that transmission. There's either a lack of lubrication, or more than likely the operator has had issues where they're not able to shift correctly, or possibly a bearing's failed, and that has caused other items to wear on themselves. So when we look at hard parts, those are going to be the most expensive. Service parts are needed anytime we start to go into a transmission. I also want to define the difference between rebuilding a transmission under customer pay and under warranty. Now, when I say customer pay, that could be yourself, right? If you're rebuilding your own transmission, you're rebuilding that on your own. So you're paying for it. When you're doing that, it's usually a good idea, since you're in the transmission, to do a full overhaul kit where you're replacing all the blocker rings and all of the bearings. Now, if you're doing this under warranty, though, where the manufacturer is paying you to do this, you're not going to replace all the components. You are only going to replace what's wrong. Now, you wouldn't normally take a transmission out under warranty to freshen it up. You'd be doing it because there's a concern. There's a noise concern or a shifting concern, and you're only replacing the worn out components or the defective components. The other portions of the transmission did not get touched, and you won't get paid for them. So that's an important kind of detail to note. I know some of you might be thinking, well, you're in there, shouldn't we just do it? That does make sense if the customer is paying for it, but since the manufacturer is paying for it, they're trying to save their money, and so therefore they don't want you to go in and replace parts unnecessarily. Now, it's not ideal for someone that doesn't ever worked on vehicles, or a novice mechanic or technician, to work on rebuilding manual transmission, or any transmission for that matter. It is important to get training on that, which, hey, how about that? You're all here for that. So you all are new to rebuilding transmissions. Some of you have done it in the past, but most of you have not. When we go into lab, you're going to be rebuilding transmissions that aren't going back into running vehicles. So they're a good test bed for you to hone your skills on. We also want to make sure that we have all the specialty tools in place and have an understanding of which ones are going to work. It's also not a bad idea, before we start to even get into the transmission or even remove it from the vehicle, to have an understanding of the availability of parts and to see if those parts are available before you start that rebuild. Personally, me at the dealership, when I'm working on transmissions or overhauling it, I don't take it or touch the vehicle until I have the parts on my bench that I know I'm going to need. And that's going to fall in line with using proper diagnosis before the case. And we'll get into that in 2 slides. But for, having an understanding of not knowing what's going on inside the transmission, it is a bit of a risk. So it's a good idea to check just the availability of the parts before you start to tear into it. Because yes, it is true that you might not know what's bad inside the transmission, but it's better for you to see where the parts are coming from, to know, oh, hey, we shouldn't even take the transmission apart. The parts are on back order. There's no ETA. I can't find them anywhere from any other distributor, and they're not on eBay or anything like that. So it's probably a good idea to double check that before you start to dive into the transmission and get too far along. What will help you with knowing what parts need to be serviced is going to be the repair manual. The repair manual is the one thing that I actually do print out. So when I'm at work, I have my transmission bench, and right next to it, I have a separate bench. So the transmission bench is a fluid bench. It's dirty. It's going to have all the transmission fluid and grease and grime and all over it. The bench next to it, or my tool cart, depending on if I'm having to work another end of the shop, will have the paper manual. I'm pretty big on electronic stuff up until this point. The reason why I have the paper manual, or at least the paper printout or explosion of the cutaway, is so that I can, visually see everything that's going on inside the transmission, and I can kind of refer back to it. I can go from one side to the other to get all the proper service info. Diagnosing the transmission before we take it out is going to be the first key thing that we need to do. We need to determine why we're overhauling it. As I brought up before, if we are doing just like a soft overhaul or we're freshening up the transmission, then that's what we know we're going to do. We're still going to go through and inspect everything. But if this is a customer complaint, we want to make sure that it's not clutch related, that it is transmission related. So that's going to be, getting as much information from the customer as possible, looking at TSBs or recalls, and then going through and doing a visual and test drive of the vehicle. Another thing that you're going to want to check first and foremost is check the fluid level. Actually, check the fluid level with the transmission installed in the vehicle, because that will be the correct fluid level for that particular vehicle. And it may be different depending on if you take it out on the bench. Checking fluid level on the transmission too, we don't have a dipstick. You're going to have to go through and open the fill plug up. Atypically, you're looking at the fluid needs to be dead level with the case of the transmission. Now, the diagram from the book is showing, a mechanic using their finger to do so. What I like to use, because your hands are going to be pretty dirty, is use a pocket screwdriver. And what you do instead is you would pull the pocket screwdriver flat and just dip it slightly. And if you pull it out and the end of the pocket screwdriver has fluid on it, you have a good level. If it's anywhere below that, then you have a low level. You need to figure out why that level is low. Now, a transmission is splash lubricated, so it should not be consuming fluid. Doesn't mean it might not be, but it shouldn't be consuming fluid. You need to figure out where that fluid is leaking from, and or was the transmission serviced prior and the incorrect level was put in the transmission. Overfilled fluid is also just as bad. It's overfilled because you take the fill plug out and it would gush all out at you. So having a catch can right below it, just in case, is usually a good idea. Overflow fluid will cause something known as cavitation. Cavitation is where you take a liquid and it foams, and that foaming of that liquid will then prevent, or the fluid, I should say, will prevent it from properly lubricating the components inside of the transmission. Now, to help with diagnosis, we don't have diagnostic trouble codes for manual transmissions, but we can use one of these diagnostic flow charts. Now, what this will look into is you'll start from the left and then you'll go and work your way to the right. So we're going to look at, what are possible causes. Is it hard shift? This requires an abnormal amount of energy to force it into gear. Possibly look for incorrect fluid, shifter linkage, and or shift fork problem. All things that can be serviced outside of the transmission with it not needing to be removed. But we can look at, something like jumps out of gear. Will shift into neutral on its own. And that's often caused by worn synchros. Same thing with clashing or grinding. Those are both indications the transmission has to come out. So again, helping with these and referring to these is really, really important. Oftentimes, these are going to be at the very front of those overhaul manuals or the service information for a manual transmission. It's also important to start out with looking at some of the major components that need to come off. Now, in the case of the T5 that's going to be highlighted in this PowerPoint, we're taking a bunch of the covers off. So the extension cover, the top cover, which can also be the shifter cover if it's not in the extension housing, and then the input bearing sleeve retainer. Those all being removed will expose different snap rings and different components that need to come out during the overhaul. And usually those components get set to the side and they don't get put back on until the very end of the overhaul. Now, in some cases, like especially with tail shaft housings, you need to make sure you're referring to service information, because they may be holding components together, and when you separate them, everything drops out, especially if it's a non-caged bearing. So make sure that you have, the ability to catch all the components, have a workbench with lips on it. That's why we have our overhaul benches all have a lip on it to prevent stuff from rolling off, or rolling off it's easy. And then also try to keep track of everything. Now, once we've gotten all the covers off, we get our first kind of view of the gear train of the transmission. It's going to be really important. Note any parts that you don't know what it is. That way you can get the orientation correct. And also to take lots of photos. So this is a prime example of, I have two different gear trains. Uh, Installing the sleeve incorrect can cause issues with it being overhauled. So what I mean by that is taking care of the fine details and like looking at that this is a tapered end and we don't have a tapered end right here. It's just flat. Noting which direction the helical gears are lining up, which direction the blocker ring teeth are going. All of those are different areas that we want to make sure we have an understanding of as we get into the overhaul of the transmission. We're also going to start to look at each individual component with greater detail. Contact patch for the gears is going to be one of them. So these transmissions are constant mesh gears. If you're dealing with an older transmission that's not constant mesh, then you'll be looking for burrs built up on the sides. But a constant mesh transmission, if we have any issues with backlash or a bearing failure, that will then wear out the gear differently than what it should be. So the acceptable pattern that we see is on the top. Now, if it starts to vary away from that, we have an acceptable range and we have an unacceptable range. We want to make sure that even if it's acceptable, what that means is it's acceptable for it to be put back in the transmission. If it's unacceptable, that means we probably have to replace that component. But either way, if it's any of this stuff like end contact patch or high contact, low contact, all of that needs to be addressed so that we can not have the transmission fail prematurely. Going through and using a feeler gauge to actually feel through the blocker ring clearance is going to be really important. We'll do the same thing with the shift forks. You'll see in another slide. But then looking to see what other components have failed. So in the case of the photo on the left here, this is a transmission that I overhauled really recently that you can see that speed gear and that countershaft gear. They are no longer functioning. They have taken out all of their teeth. Now the risk is that all of the surrounding gears may have had metal chipped into them as well. So we have to really pay particular attention that we get all the metal out of this transmission. But these two components would require us to would require us to overhaul it. Now that doesn't mean we stop right there. We continue on taking the transmission apart to find what the root cause was with why these failed. Did this fail because of a lack of lubrication? Did it fail because the driver did not have the talent to be able to shift the transmission in and out of gear? Is there a bearing or a preload issue that caused these gears to wear in on themselves? All of that needs to be taken into consideration when we're looking at what the fail point is with this gearbox. Now, quite often when you have failures like that, it's usually going to mean that you have to uh, replace the transmission because everything else will be damaged. We're going to inspect the blocker rings pretty extensively. Now, I said before the blocker rings are soft parts, but if you're trying to figure out like why a transmission is having shifting issues and you want to put the root cause as a worn out blocker ring, you need to determine why it's a worn out blocker ring. So if it is a full brass or bronze blocker ring and it has the spiral cut ends on it, are they nice and sharp or are they rounded off? If they're rounded off, then that's defective. The height or the clearance, the more clearance, the better with a blocker ring. The less clearance we have, the more worn out that blocker ring is. And it's probably not going to be gripping the speed gear all that well. And there will be a clashing when we go into gear. We also want to look to see if the shift forks are worn out. So we're going to be using the feeler gauge to go in between the sliders of the synchronizer and the shift fork. In some cases, the shift forks are serviceable. You can change out different pads. In other cases, you can't. So this could again be due to binding or sticking. And we're checking every single component. Therefore, we can determine whether or not we can continue with the overhaul. Now, from this point forward, we have a whole bunch of different slides that are going into overhauling the T5 transmission. The T5 transmission is a very popular transmission made by Borg Warner. I'm not going to go into the greater details with it, but if you would like to use this as a guide, please do. We will be going step by step with our transmission. But let's look at some of the key details once we do get the transmission completely apart. Now, one of the things, once we get the main shafts out of the transmission, the main and output shaft, the counter shaft, and the input shaft, one of the key things that I want to make sure there's an understood detail is we want to make sure that we're overhauling each shaft individually. And once we've determined what parts are worn out, reassemble it loosely. That way you don't lose track of the components and you keep the orientation, or you zip tie them all correctly. in the correct orientation that they came apart. In some cases, the components will be held on with an interference fit, and we will need a bearing splitter and a hydraulic press. When we do use a bearing splitter, we want to make sure that we're completely supporting the speed gear as to not crack it unnecessarily. It doesn't take a ton of force to press these apart, but we want to have consistent force. That's why you're not going to be hitting it with a hammer. You're going to be pressing it down nice and even and equally. Once we do have all the components taken apart, whether or not we're pressing the components or whether or not we're able to bolt them apart, cleaning is going to be a very important thing. When it comes to transmission overhauls, a manual transmission overhaul, you can throw that in a regular hot tank. It'll be okay. Just make sure you completely clean everything out. It's not a bad idea to use a solvent tank to clean everything, but do keep in mind if you're doing an automatic, you do not put it in a hot tank. We also want to too make sure we lower the temperature down. Some of these hot tanks can get upwards of 300 degrees. That is enough to where we can start to warp the cases if they're aluminum or crack them if that's the case. So it's a good idea to double check and turn down the temperature before you put the components in and allow the hot tank to cool down a small amount. Now, inspecting the case of the transmission is going to be really important. Checking for warpage on any of the gasket mating surfaces can be the cause of a leak, and we want to determine why they're warped too. Now, we're not running a ton of heat through these transmissions. If they do get really hot, then that can cause it to warp. But that's pretty unlikely. Usually if it's getting warped because of heat, we've been running extensively with really low fluid and even then the bearings probably will lock up and fail before the case warps. But where we can have an issue is if it's not torqued down correctly or if the dowel pins have failed supporting the case. And that can result in warpage, but it can also result in cracks. We also want to make sure we're checking concentricity in terms of all of our bored holes. And this is where a snap bore gauge can come in really handy. The snap bore gauge is it's shaped like a T and it has a little end that will allow for two probes to spring out and then you can lock it down and can use a set of calipers or you can use a set of micrometers to measure what that bore is. And you're going to be checking it in about 5 or 6 different spots so that you know that you're keeping everything as concentric as we possibly can. All right, and the last thing I want to kind of touch on, because there's going to be finer details to overhauling that we'll go over during lab and assembly, but we're going to spend the next couple of weeks going into that. So I will give greater details on that as we go forward. But last thing I kind of want to touch on is measuring and adjusting end shaft preload and bearing play. When we're doing this, it's a good idea to check this before and after the overhaul. So you're checking it before to see if it's out of spec, and then you're checking it after to kind of quality control check and make sure that the transmission was assembled correctly. Now, the manufacturers will specify the certain amount of preload for the input shaft and the output shaft based off of what type of bearings are supporting everything and also what type of transmission it is. So it is important to make sure you refer to those numbers. Now, the preload, that's going to be where we're using that turning torque wrench. And if it's tapered roller bearings, there is going to be a set amount of preload for those bearings to live a long life. If it is roller bearings, you still want to double check it to make sure that we're not causing too much friction or building up heat inside the transmission. Now, checking end play, we're going to use a dial indicator. So we will clamp the dial indicator to somewhere solid on the case, and then we'll place the dial indicator pointer on the very end of the transmission input shaft. It's really helpful on the vices like we have photoed here. Because then what we're able to do is you zero the vise with the shaft all the way down and gravity holding it down, and then you're going to move the input shaft up. So you're going to grab the input shaft. Usually you need to use a set of vice grips very loosely around the spline so you don't damage them to move it up and down. And you're going to take that measurement to determine what the ultimate play is. You really don't want to be greater than about 25 thousandths of an inch. But no tighter than 5 thousandths of an inch. That tends to be the good working area if you can't find the spec. The last thing that you would do is you would go through and you would double check to make sure the transmission shifts into and out of all of the gears. Usually that does require you to have the shifter assembly. For S40 Hondas, it's going to be kind of comical because the shifter assembly is like 4 feet long because it's straight out of a car. Why I have it so long is cutting it down isn't the best option for that, and you get more leverage to be able to shift it in and out of gears. So we'll be doing that before and after to double check to make sure the transmission is functioning. And it's a good idea to do so because it's way easier to correct the issue if you made a mistake while it's still on the bench than versus tearing it back out of the car. So, well, 194 slide presentation kind of wrapped up. Like I said, we're not going to go through all of them, but if you want to do refer to them, please refer to them. The PowerPoint is up on the course Canvas page for your review. But I do appreciate you sticking around to the end of the lecture, and I will see you in the next one.